The farmer had lived on the land for decades, attuned to the rhythms of nature, the sounds of the fields, and the patterns of the sky. But on this particular evening, an unsettling feeling crept into the air. The atmosphere was still, with the sun hanging low over the hills, casting a golden glow across the farm. Everything seemed calm, yet something felt off. A sharp cry suddenly pierced the silence, breaking the stillness. Looking up, the farmer spotted a falcon circling above the barn. At first, little thought was given to it. Birds of prey were common in the area, often hunting in the open fields for small rodents or unsuspecting prey. However, something about this falcon's behavior was unusual. It wasn't hunting. Instead, it called out repeatedly, its cries loud and urgent. The bird dipped lower, then ascended again, flapping its wings frantically, almost as if trying to send a message or get someone's attention. The farmer stood still, watching the bird with growing concern. Falcons had been seen before, but never behaving like this. Shaking his head, the farmer turned back toward the house, intent on finishing the day's work. But just as a step was taken, the falcon let out another sharp cry and swooped down toward the barn. It didn't attack or land. Instead, it hovered briefly before climbing back into the sky, acting deliberately, as if guiding someone towards something. A sense of unease settled into the farmer's gut. Wiping hands on worn-out jeans, a deep breath was taken. Something inside urged a check of the barn. Perhaps a wounded animal was inside, or maybe a predator had made its way in. The thought of a fox or coyote lurking among the livestock caused unease. Grabbing a lantern, the farmer made his way to the barn. Upon reaching the entrance, it was noticed that the large wooden doors were slightly ajar, which was odd because they had been certain to shut them earlier. Pushing them open, he stepped inside. The scent of hay and damp wood filled the nostrils, while the light from the lantern cast long shadows against the walls. Everything appeared normal at first. The barn was silent, except for the occasional rustle of straw. Just as a turn was made to leave, a faint sound was heard. Almost too soft to notice, a barely audible whimper came from the far end of the barn. Stopping in his tracks, the farmer listened closely. There it was again, a tiny noise, weak and fragile. The pulse quickened. Something was there. Cautiously moving toward the sound, boots crunched against the dirt floor. Reaching the corner where stacks of hay were piled high, the sound emanated from somewhere beneath them. Setting the lantern down, hay was pushed away quickly. The deeper the digging, the louder the sound became. Finally, as the last layer of straw was pulled away, a freeze occurred. Nestled together, barely moving, were two tiny bear cubs. Their fur was slightly damp, their small bodies curled tightly against each other. They looked weak and helpless, their eyes barely open. The farmer's breath caught in his throat. Bears were not common in this area, and even if they were, a mother bear would never leave her cubs alone. The falcon let out another sharp cry from above, breaking the trance. Looking up at the bird, still perched on the wooden beam, it hadn't left. It had led to this discovery. The realization sent a chill through the body. The falcon had known about the cubs before anyone else. It had been trying to ensure they were found. Turning back to the cubs, one let out a soft, weak cry. Cold and fragile, without their mother, survival would be unlikely. Kneeling beside them, racing thoughts filled the mind. How had they ended up here? Where was their mother? Why had a falcon of all creatures guided to them? As the helpless cubs were stared at, one thing was certain. This was no ordinary discovery. Something much bigger was at play, something not yet understood. The farmer remained crouched beside the cubs, struggling to make sense of what was being seen. These were not just lost animals wandering onto the farm. They were far too young to be without their mother, and yet there was no sign of her anywhere. Their small bodies trembled as they pressed against each other for warmth, breathing shallowly with tiny limbs barely moving. They had been there for a while, long enough to grow weak. The first instinct was to look around for clues. Standing, the barn was scanned, searching for any sign of how they got inside. The doors had been slightly open upon arrival, but they were heavy and wouldn't swing open on their own. There were no large gaps or broken boards in the barn walls. Nothing that would allow a bear, even a small one, to squeeze through. The only explanation was that they had been placed there. But that didn't make sense. Who would bring bear cubs to a barn and leave them hidden under a pile of hay? The falcon let out another cry from its perch above. It hadn't moved since the cubs were discovered. Looking up at the bird, its sharp eyes locked on. Unsettled feelings arose. It had guided here for a reason, but why? Did it care about these cubs? Falcons were predators. They did not form bonds with other animals, especially ones that would grow into dangerous creatures. Turning back to the cubs, their condition was assessed. They were frail, their fur matted with dirt and bits of hay. When reaching out slowly, one flinched but lacked the strength to move away. The other barely reacted at all. Help was needed, and quickly. If left much longer, survival was unlikely. Hesitation struck. Little was known about caring for wild animals, especially bears. If the mother was nearby, she would return for them. But if gone, they had no chance on their own. The right thing to do would be to call the authorities, maybe a wildlife rescue team. They would know how to handle it. But a part resisted. Living off the land his entire life, nature was understood better than most. Something about this situation felt wrong. The cubs had been left deliberately. Sending them away before understanding why might mean never finding out what really happened. With careful hands, they were picked up one at a time. So small they barely weighed anything. They were cradled gently, feeling the slight rise and fall of their chests as they took weak breaths. Carried inside, they were set down on a soft blanket near the fireplace. Warmth was needed more than anything right now. Milk was heated, and a clean rag soaked in it was carefully offered to the cubs. At first, they were too weak to respond. But after a moment, one sucked at the damp fabric, taking in small drops of liquid. Encouraged, the process continued, ensuring they got enough to at least gain some strength. The second cub remained limp, barely moving, but after some time, its breathing became steadier. Outside, the falcon remained perched near the barn, still watching. A feeling lingered that it was waiting for something. Stepping outside, the tree line in the distance was scanned. The sun had almost disappeared behind the hills, and darkness was creeping in. If the mother was still out there, she would be searching for her cubs by now. But the woods were silent. No movement, no rustling in the undergrowth. Only the wind and the fading cries of the falcon broke the stillness. Something was wrong. The mother should have been there by now. If separated from her cubs, desperation to find them would drive her. But the night was approaching, and there was no sign of her anywhere. Many animals in distress had been seen before, always fighting to reunite with their young. If she wasn't here, either she couldn't find them, or something had stopped her from returning. A chill ran through as the grim possibility was realized. Something had happened to her. Stepping back inside, the cubs were looked at again. If the mother wasn't coming back, it was up to figure out what had happened. How they ended up in the barn needed to be known, and more importantly, whether they were in danger. Sitting near the fireplace, the cubs were watched closely. Trembling had stopped, their tiny bodies slowly absorbing the warmth of the fire. One let out a weak, almost pitiful sound, a small cry that barely reached the ears. The other remained still, breathing slow but steady. They were fragile, too fragile to have survived out there on their own for long. The mystery of how they got here gnawed. There were no signs of a struggle in or around the barn, no tracks leading to its entrance. It was as if they had simply appeared. Stepping outside, the barn was looked at once more. The falcon was still there, perched high on the wooden beam, watching in complete silence. It hadn't left since the cubs were found, which was unsettling. A bird of prey should have moved on by now, uninterested in creatures that posed no threat or benefit. Yet it stayed, sharp eyes locked onto the barn, never once losing focus, always believing that animals had instincts beyond human understanding. Sensing things people often missed, the question lingered. What was this falcon trying to convey? Walking back toward the barn, stepping inside once more, the spot where the cubs had been found was examined. The hay had loosely covered them, as if someone or something had tried to hide them, but hadn't buried them completely. They had been placed there deliberately. That much was clear now. Thoughts returned to the mother bear. If alive, she should have found them by now. Fiercely protective, a mother bear would fight for her cubs, not wander off leaving them behind unless something had gone terribly wrong. A soft rustling sound caused a turn. The falcon had shifted its position, moving lower now, perching on a beam closer to where the cubs had been found. Its head tilted slightly, sharp gaze fixed on the same spot inspected moments ago. A frown formed. It almost looked like the bird was leading toward something, just as it had earlier. Taking a few slow steps forward, the barn was scanned again. The wooden walls were worn from years of weather and time, but remained sturdy. The doors were heavy and didn't swing open easily. The only other way into the barn was the small opening near the rafters, too high for anything but a bird to pass through. The cubs hadn't walked in. They hadn't been dragged in by a predator. Someone had put them there. But who? The falcon let out a short, sharp cry. Looking up at it again, unease settled in the chest. The bird had known about the cubs before anyone else, alerting to their presence. Had the lead not been followed, the cubs might not have survived the night. It was almost as if the falcon had been protecting them. Never had anything like this been heard of before. Birds of prey didn't care for creatures outside their own kind. They were hunters, scavengers, but not guardians. Yet there was no denying what had been seen. The falcon had stayed near the barn, circling, calling out, refusing to leave until they were found. And now, even after they were safe inside, it hadn't gone away. The realization sent a chill through the body. This was not normal animal behavior. This was something else. A sudden gust of wind swept through the farm, rustling the trees at the property's edge. Light had almost completely faded, the sky turning a deep shade of blue. Night was settling in, and the cub's mother was still nowhere to be found. Turning back toward the house, answers were needed, but caution was also necessary. If the mother bear was alive and searching for her cubs, she wouldn't stop until she found them. If dead, something had taken her, and whatever it was could still be nearby. The falcon gave one last cry before settling back into silence. It was looked at once more before stepping inside. An unsettling feeling lingered. This was only the beginning of something far bigger than could yet be understood. Sleep was scarce that night. The strange series of events kept circling back. The discovery of the cubs, the falcon's persistence, and the eerie absence of their mother. All weighed heavily. Something was not right. Decades had been spent in these parts, witnessing all kinds of wildlife, but never had anything quite like this been encountered. Unable to ignore instincts, action was decided upon. Before going to bed, an old motion-activated camera was set up near the barn, hoping to capture any movement during the night. If the mother bear was out there searching for her cubs, she might come back. If there was another explanation for how they ended up in the barn, the camera might reveal it. As the first light of dawn crept through the window, rising from the chair, tired limbs were stretched, and the way outside was made. Air was crisp, carrying the scent of damp earth and the distant rustle of leaves. The falcon was still there, perched on the barn's highest beam, watching silently. The sight of it unsettled. He had been there all night. With cautious steps, the camera was retrieved and taken inside, eager but uneasy about what might be found. Set down on the table, connected to an old laptop, play was pressed. Footage was grainy in the dim light of the barn, but clear enough. At first, nothing seemed unusual. The barn was empty, doors unmoving. Then, around midnight, movement flickered in the corner of the frame. The Falcon appeared, swooping low through the opening near the rafters, wings spread wide before landing on a beam. It perched there, unmoving, sharp eyes scanning the ground below. Then, something unexpected happened. The Falcon hopped down from its perch, landing near the pile of hay where the cubs had been hidden. It nudged at the hay with its beak, inspecting the spot. It wasn't hunting or searching for food. It was watching over them. Leaning closer to the screen, the pulse quickened. This was not normal behavior. Falcons didn't guard other animals, let alone ones that posed no benefit. But the footage was undeniable. The bird had been there before anyone had stepped foot in the barn. It had known. The next few minutes of footage sent a chill. The Falcon remained near the cubs, shifting its weight, adjusting its wings, almost as if trying to keep them warm. Then, at one point, it extended a wing over them. It wasn't much, just a brief, instinctual movement. But it was enough. Sitting back in the chair, stunned, it was clear. The Falcon had not just led to the cubs. It had been protecting them all along. But why? Fast-forwarding through the footage, the remaining hours of the night were scanned. The Falcon barely moved, standing guard over the cubs as they slept. No signs of their mother, no large animal approaching the barn. Nothing that explained how they got there. And then, in the final moments of the recording, just before dawn, something even more unsettling happened. The Falcon suddenly stiffened, its head snapping toward the open doors of the barn. Its body tensed, wings slightly raised, as if sensing something unseen. It remained that way for several minutes before finally relaxing again. Something had been out there. Rubbing temples, everything was pieced together. The cubs had been placed in the barn, not wandered in. The Falcon had stayed with them, ensuring they were found. Now, something had lurked just beyond the barn doors, unseen by the camera, but sensed by the bird. Standing, glancing toward the window, the sun had risen, casting golden light over the land. Today, more answers would be searched for. The cub's mother had to be out there somewhere. If not, something had happened to her, and if that was the case, whatever had taken her might still be close by. No time was wasted. Stepping outside, the crisp morning air filled the lungs, but there was no comfort in it. The mind was set on one thing: finding the cub's mother. If she was out there, she needed to be located before it was too late. If injured, she might be unable to reach her young. If gone, something had taken her, and that meant danger was closer than wanted to believe. Grabbing the rifle, not because it was intended to be used, but because the unknown had settled too close to home, the way to the woods was made. Following the fence line where the land met the dense thicket, the path had been walked countless times. But today, every sound, every movement in the undergrowth felt sharper, heavier. Scanning the ground, tracks were looked for. At first, nothing unusual was seen. Then, after a few more steps, deep claw marks were noticed in the dirt. Bears. The impressions were fresh, not more than a day old. Breath hitched as a crouch was made to inspect them closer. The tracks were larger than expected. They belonged to an adult bear, likely the mother of the cubs. But something was wrong. The way the marks dragged slightly, the uneven placement of the steps. She hadn't been walking normally. She had been limping, jaw tightened. If injured, she could be struggling somewhere, unable to reach her cubs. Following the tracks deeper into the forest, boots pressed into the damp earth. The trail twisted through the trees, leading further from the farm, deeper into the unknown. Minutes turned into an hour. The silence of the woods felt unnatural, as if something had disturbed the balance of nature. Birds should have been calling. Squirrels should have been rustling through the leaves. But there was nothing. The weight of the silence pressed on the chest, an unspoken warning. Then, something was seen. A patch of fur snagged on a low branch, golden brown against the rough bark. Reaching for it, the coarse strands were rubbed between fingers. It was fresh. Stepping forward cautiously, pushing past a dense thicket of bushes, a halt occurred. Barely visible between the trees, a shape lay motionless on the forest floor. Stomach twisted as another step forward was taken. The shape became clearer. It was a bear, curled on its side, its body still. Heart pounded. She had been found. But was she alive? Approaching carefully, fingers gripped the rifle, though a prayer was made that it wouldn't need to be used. Getting closer, the shallow rise and fall of her chest was noticed. She was breathing. Relief flooded through, but it was quickly replaced by concern. Her fur was matted with dirt, and dark stains were near her shoulder. She had been hurt. Crouching beside her, the wound was inspected. It wasn't a deep gash, but it was enough to weaken her. Likely, she had been attacked, though by what wasn't yet known. Scanning the area, signs of a struggle were searched for. Broken branches, disturbed earth, scattered tufts of fur. Clearly, she had fought something off. But where was the threat now? Suddenly, the falcon's cries rang through the trees, sharp and urgent. Turning back toward the direction of the farm, the bird, which hadn't left its perch for hours, was now calling out, its voice slicing through the silence. A cold realization settled in the gut. The falcon had sensed something before, something the camera hadn't captured. And now it was calling again. Something was out there. Looking at the bear, she was too weak to move on her own. But if left alone, she wouldn't stand a chance. A choice had to be made. Guard her, or get back to the farm before it was too late. Gritting teeth, the falcon's warning could not be ignored. If something was near the farm, the cubs were in danger. Without wasting another second, a turn was made, and the way back through the forest was run. Heart pounded as the farmer sprinted through the woods. Twigs snapped beneath boots, and branches tore at sleeves. But slowing down wasn't an option. The falcon's cries still echoed in the distance, sharp and relentless, a warning that sent a chill through the spine. Something was happening back at the farm, and getting there before it was too late was imperative. Bursting out of the tree line, the barn came into sight. The falcon had taken flight, circling wildly above the property, wings cutting through the sky. The cubs were inside the house, safe for now, but tension in the air told that something was wrong. Gripping the rifle tighter, the area was scanned. Then, it was seen. At the edge of the field, limping through the tall grass, was the mother bear. Somehow, she had found the strength to follow the trail, dragging her injured body step by step toward the farm. Her head was low, her breaths labored, but fierce determination was in her eyes. She was desperate, searching, looking for her cubs. A pang of guilt was felt. Taking them in to protect them had unknowingly separated them from their mother. Now she was here, weak but determined, drawn by some instinct stronger than pain, stronger than exhaustion. Letting out a low, guttural sound, a deep call that rumbled through the air. It was not a roar of aggression, but a call of longing, a mother calling for her young. The cubs inside the house must have heard it, because suddenly, a faint, high-pitched cry came from within. The bear's ears perked up, and for the first time, she lifted her head fully. Many things had been seen in a lifetime, but nothing like this. The weight of the moment pressed down. She had fought through her injuries, through whatever had attacked her, just to reach this place. Now the cubs were calling back to her. A decision had to be made. Slowly, carefully, backing away toward the house, movements were kept slow and deliberate. Not wanting to startle her, she was exhausted, but a mother's strength was unpredictable, especially when her young were involved. Reaching the front door, stepping inside, the cubs were found still nestled in the blanket near the fireplace. They were more alert now, tiny ears twitching, bodies stirring at the sound of their mother's call. Hesitating for only a second, they were picked up, one in each arm, feeling their warmth against the chest. Stepping outside again, the mother bear had moved closer. She was near the barn now, breathing ragged, body swaying slightly. On the verge of collapse, she did not stop. Walking slowly toward the open space between them, posture was kept non-threatening. The cubs whimpered softly in arms, and as they did, the bear let out another deep sound, this time softer, almost pleading. Taking a deep breath, kneeling down carefully, they were set on the ground a few feet away. They hesitated for a moment, as if uncertain. Then one took a wobbly step forward. The second followed. Their small forms moved across the grass toward the towering figure of their mother. The moment they reached her, she lowered her head, touching her nose to them, sniffing them as if to make sure they were real. Then, in a moment that sent a lump to the throat, she licked them gently, pulling them closer with a weak but determined movement of her paw. The cubs pressed against her, their small cries filled with relief. Watching in silence, the rifle was forgotten at the side. Tension, maybe even danger, had been expected, but what was witnessed was something entirely different. It was a moment of pure, unshakable love. A mother reuniting with the young she had fought so hard to reach. The falcon, still circling overhead, let out one final cry before soaring higher, disappearing into the endless blue sky. Its job was done, remaining still, watching as the bear nuzzled her cubs, gathering what little strength she had left. She did not seem afraid, or show any signs of hostility. It was as if she understood that help had been given. Taking a few steps back, space was given. The cubs clung to her, tiny bodies pressing into her fur. Slowly, with effort, she began to move. Turning toward the trees, pausing only once to glance back. It was brief, just a flicker of acknowledgement. But in that single moment, something passed. Then, with her cubs at her side, she disappeared into the woods. Letting out a breath that hadn't been realized was being held. The morning sun had fully risen now, casting golden light over the land. It felt different, lighter, as if something profound had taken place, something rare and extraordinary. Turning the gaze to the sky, the falcon was searched for, but it was gone. Knowing full well that full understanding of what had happened might never come. Why the falcon had led to the cubs, why it had stayed, why the mother bear had arrived just in time. Some things in nature couldn't be explained. All that was known was that something truly remarkable had been witnessed, and it would never be forgotten. Standing in the open field long after the mother bear and her cubs had vanished into the trees, heart was still racing, though the danger had passed. What had just happened was beyond explanation. Always believing in the instincts of animals, in the balance of nature, this was something else. It was as if the falcon had known all along what needed to be done. Turning back toward the farm, gaze lifting to the barn's highest beam, the falcon was no longer there. It had disappeared, its purpose fulfilled. An odd sense of loss lingered, as if a guardian that had been watching over had finally left. It had been there from the beginning, guiding to the cubs, ensuring their survival, staying until they were safely reunited with their mother. But why? The question lingered in the mind as the way back to the house was made. Morning sun was higher now, its golden light making the events of the past day seem almost surreal. Stepping inside, glancing at the fireplace where only a few hours ago the cubs had been huddled, weak and helpless, now they were gone, back where they belonged. The house felt strangely empty without them. Pouring a cup of coffee, sitting down at the kitchen table, the footage from the barn was replayed one more time. Already seen, already stunned by what it revealed, but needing to watch again to make sure it hadn't been imagined. The screen flickered, and there it was, the falcon, not just watching over the cubs, but protecting them. It had nudged them, hovered near them, even spread its wings in what seemed like an attempt to shelter them. The behavior was not just unusual, It was unheard of. Falcons were hunters, solitary creatures that cared only for their own survival. But this one had done something extraordinary. Footage from the late-night hours showed something even more chilling. The falcon had sensed something in the darkness. At the time, assuming it was just the night playing tricks on the mind, but now certain, something had been near the barn. Thinking about the mother bear's injuries, the way she had struggled to walk, the desperate fight she must have endured before reaching the farm, whatever had attacked her had left her too weak to care for her cubs, forcing her to leave them behind. Somehow, the falcon had taken it upon itself to ensure they were found. Leaning back in the chair, exhaling slowly, stories had been heard before about animals displaying acts of compassion, but nothing like this. The falcon had no reason to care, no reason to intervene, yet it had done so. Had it simply recognized the cubs as helpless and acted on instinct? Or was there something deeper at play, something beyond human understanding? Looking out the window, scanning the sky, half expecting to see the falcon perched nearby, watching as it had before, but there was nothing. It had done its part and moved on. The events of the past day had changed something. Always respecting the wild, always understanding that nature followed its own rules. But this had shown something more. An unseen thread that connected all living things. A silent understanding that existed between creatures of different worlds. The falcon had saved the cubs. It had saved their mother. And in some way, it had changed everything.